Hey everybody, welcome back to Run and Gun. I'm JT, and today I've been scrolling through Instagram just a little bit this morning, and I've kind of been seeing what's new, what's trending, and I really enjoy this kind of dark, moody, foresty look. A lot of people are doing it, and I created a similar video to this, but there's a bunch of different ways that you can recreate this look. So today we're going to recreate this look in Photoshop. So let's kind of pick an image to be a little bit inspired by and see if we can recreate the colors and the style of this photograph. So I really like this waterfall photograph over here, and I actually just happen to have a bunch of waterfall photos from my recent videos. So let's open up one of those waterfall photos and see if we can do a halfway decent job at recreating this look. So let's open up our image in Photoshop. So I have our raw photo here. As you can see, I took the photo up here at f11, 1/40th of a second, just to get that little bit of motion in the water, ISO 200, and I took it on a 14-24 lens at 14 millimeters. So super wide shot, got a little bit of this hazy sky up here and a nice wide shot of this waterfall. So let's get into our basic settings here and see what we can do to at least get this image halfway to where we want it and do basic corrections before we bring it into Photoshop. So our white balance looks pretty good. It's a little bit warm. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit and cool down that color temperature a little bit. And it also looks a tiny bit too green, so I'm going to add a little bit of magenta, which will take away some of that green. Just a couple points right there, not too much. You don't want to overdo it. So the exposure looks pretty good. I'm going to bring down the contrast, and then we're going to move to highlights. Now, I don't typically recommend moving down the highlights a lot, but in this case, the highlights are kind of clipped up there, and I'm going to move the highlight slider down quite a bit in this image. But remember, it all depends on the look that you're going for in your particular image. Maybe I move the slider a lot in my image, and you don't necessarily have to move it so much in yours. All of these, just kind of tweak every step to taste, and you'll get a great looking image. Now, I'm not going to play with shadows here at all. The whites, I'm going to move up the white slider, and then I'm going to move up, I'm going to move the black slider down about 25, 26 in the negative, so I get a little bit more contrast and kind of crush these shadows. Now, as you can see in this look, these are very sharp, and it looks like someone really was heavy with that clarity slider. So I'm going to turn the clarity up quite a bit. I usually try not to go past 20, 25, 30. That's usually the max. Your image starts looking really terrible if you take it up to like 100 or 50. So I actually think 30 looks pretty good. Let's keep scrolling. So vibrance and saturation, I'm actually going to leave those alone for right now. We'll play with those a little bit more when we get into Photoshop. That looks good. Let's see, I always want to sharpen my images. Whenever I'm working with digital images, I always want to add that little bit of sharpening, usually around 50, and then add that little bit of detail as well and do a tiny bit of noise reduction. We can zoom in to our image anywhere between 60 and 100% and see what that sharpening is doing. And you can see a little bit, very tiny bit of noise in the shadows. We're not going to notice it too much in our final image, but I'll do a tiny bit of luminance noise reduction. So let's fit this image back to our view and see what else we can mess with. Let's go into our tone curve right now. We dropped down those highlights, and that took a huge chunk. Over here you can see our histogram. That took a huge chunk of our highlights and slid them to the left because we're going for a dark and moody image, not a bright and vibrant or bright and lively image. We can see right here on our histogram, this little spike correlates to this blown out overexposed part of our sky and the little bit of highlights that are going on here in our waterfall. So I actually want to save those and preserve those. So I'm going to slide our highlight slider just to the right, and you can see that little bit of highlights kind of coming back. And we want to have that contrast. I just want to take the overall highlights down in the image, but the spike of bright whites there, I want to keep those. So take our lights here down, take our darks down quite a bit. And as you can see, we're creating this S-shaped tone curve compared to our linear curve that we used to have. And then we're going to take our shadows down quite a bit right there. I'm actually going to bring our lights back. I pushed that a little bit too far. And as you can see, we're creating this very slight S curve, and we'll do a lot more with that in Photoshop. So that is our tone curve. We played with our sharpening. So let's go into our HSL sliders, or hue, saturation, and luminance. So I'm not going to mess with our hue too much. I'm going to take some of our yellow tones and our yellow hues. I'm going to move those over to green. There's not too much yellow going on in these trees here. It's very green, so I'm going to leave a little bit of yellow, but I'm going to make it mostly green and turn the green, make it a little bit cooler towards the blue. So let's take a look at our saturation though. So this is the saturation of all our hues. If I wanted to turn the green saturation all the way down, I could individually turn the saturation of green all the way down. Super helpful. I don't think there's anything in here that I really want to turn down too much. I'm going to turn down, or excuse me, I'm going to turn up our blues. And if I were to max this out, you can see that really brings up the blues in our waterfall, which is really cool, but I overdid it quite a bit. So I'm just going to bring back the blues and the aquas back up in our waterfall. So that looks pretty good. Nothing else too crazy going on here with color. Sometimes I like in these moody images to bring back the reds and the oranges just so that I have something to contrast with the green. So I'll bring down our green saturation about -40. Looks good. You don't want too much green in there, even though it is a foresty look. The key to this look is kind of a dark desaturated look and some heavy greens, which we have up here towards the top of the image. So let's look at our luminance tab. And our luminance tab allows us to either brighten or darken different sections of the image based on hue. So I could take, for example, our greens, and I could lighten all our greens, which I'm going to a tiny bit. I'm going to do the same with our yellows because there's quite a bit of yellow in green. And same with our aquas, brighten up that waterfall. And then maybe darken some of these images. The rocks have an orangish, reddish tint to them. So I'll darken those up. Actually, I'm gonna have to move the slider quite a bit for it to have an effect. There's not as much orange as I thought. That looks good. So what I'm gonna do next is in our split toning, I'm gonna add blue to our shadows, cool down our shadows to give that kind of dark feel. I'm gonna leave the highlights alone. The highlights are fairly desaturated and there's no split toning really added to the highlights in these images. I usually like to remove any chromatic aberration. It's kind of an automatic thing I do when I'm in Camera Raw or Lightroom. And then another awesome thing that has been added to the newer versions of Lightroom and Camera Raw is this dehaze slider. It's absolutely a blast to play with. When you mess with it, you can add haze or you can take haze away, and it just adds contrast in the midtones, and I love playing with this slider. So that is it, and we are done with this image in Camera Raw. So let's take it into Photoshop and see what we have and see what we can do in Photoshop and finish this image up. All right, so now we have our image open in Photoshop. We're close, but we're not quite there. We're gonna add some tweaks that we couldn't exactly do in Camera Raw, and we're gonna see what we can do with this image. So the final image I have here, once I've added some dodging and burning and then added our curves, here's our final dark, moody, foresty image, which looks quite a bit like this dark, moody vibe that we can see here on Instagram. We're super close. And this mood really depends on the image that you're working with. You can't take an image in broad daylight or broad sunlight and expect to get that moody vibe. You kind of have to have an overcast day or a dark area, for example, inside a forest. That's why this works so well. You have those dark greens, and especially these images that have mist or fog going on, it really lends to the atmosphere of that effect, and it really sells that effect. So you can push an image really far in Photoshop, but make sure you're taking an image with the intent to go for this dark and moody or dark foresty feel. So this is our final image. I'm going to turn off all these layers and go with you step by step and see how we created each one of these layers and how to recreate them. So let's turn off this curves group. So inside of this curves group, you can see a handful of different adjustment layers. I have color balance, curves 1, hue and saturation, and curves 2. And I'm going to show you what each and every single one of those does. I created a color balance correction up here, and I also created a vignette down here, layer 1. Let's shut that off for right now. So as you can see, the color balance, the image was feeling a little bit too green almost, and I didn't want to lose these orange tones. So I created a color balance correction where I moved the midtones towards the blue. I made sure that my shadows, I added a little red to the shadows. They were feeling too cool and too blue. You want a little contrast. You want a bit of warm tones somewhere in the image just for some contrast, especially in these rocks here. Rocks aren't green, so I needed that contrast. And you can see here in the highlights, I added a cyan, added a little green to the highlights up here where the sun was hitting and the light was hitting this green and foliage up here on the rocks. And then I also cooled off the highlights. So that is what I did for color balance. Let's take a look at this first curves layer. So opening up this curves layer, you can see this is where we're starting to get our lifted shadows. And there's a big difference between crushed shadows and lifted shadows. So let's actually delete this layer and recreate. So to recreate this layer, let's go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and Curves. And as I was saying, there's a pretty big difference between crushed shadows and lifted shadows. A lot of people get them confused, and it's really extremely important to know the difference because they're two very different looks. Now, crushed shadows is when you take your shadows and you absolutely crush them to oblivion. This is how I remember it. Everything starts turning black. You lose absolutely all of your detail to black oblivion. They're just gone. Now, lifted shadows is when you actually lift your curve right here. And as you can see, I am physically lifting up my shadows. I'm bringing more detail into the image in my shadows. Now, too much of either one of these can be a bad thing. You don't want to crush your shadows or lift your shadows too much, but it all depends on the look that you're going for. So in this case, I'm going to reset this and let's play with our shadows. What do these images look like? From the looks of it, I'm seeing lifted shadows. There's no shadows that are super black in here. They all kind of have this grayish tone. So I'm gonna go back into Photoshop and we are going to lift our shadows. But as you can see in those images, those shadows weren't gray, they were still kind of a dark black. So I'm gonna create a new point right here and bring those shadows down. We don't want too much detail in the shadows because if you have too much detail in your image, your eye doesn't know where to look. So we'll crush back those shadows a little and create some dark tones in those shadows, but we still wanna lift them. I'm actually gonna do that a little more. We can see we're losing detail, not because of lifting, but because we brought this extra point in here. We don't want too much detail in this image. And it looks like the same with the highlights. I'm gonna bring those down so they're kind of like a grayish now instead of a bright white. We don't want all of our attention going up towards the sky. We want our attention on this waterfall. And then create that S curve for a tiny bit of contrast. So that looks good so far. We'll turn that layer and minimize that. And so to turn back on our hue and saturation, I went in and I turned down the whole image's saturation about -17. I'm gonna turn it down more to about -20 is a good spot. This again is up to what your image looks like partway through editing. I turned it down in this particular image just because the saturation was still too much. Now let's scroll up a little bit. You can see we have a whole other curves layer up here. Now what's that for? Again, this was just tweaking to taste. We'll turn that on. I wanted to add more contrast because again, we took away some of our contrast in this curves layer. We got rid of that contrast by lifting up our shadows and bringing down our highlights. And I want to just add a tiny bit of punch back to the image. What we're going to do is we're going to scroll down here and we can see I have a vignette layer here. I add one to almost all of my images, even if it's very subtle, just so that I can guide your eye and guide the audience's eye to where I want you to look in this photograph. So let's turn on our vignette layer. And as you can see, it brings your attention right towards the middle, towards the waterfall. And everything else kind of just falls off into the shadows over here. So what's a very simple way of creating a vignette? Well, I'm gonna delete this one. We're gonna go down here, create a new layer, make sure that layer is underneath all of our corrections. And then the simplest way for me to create a vignette is I like to go over here to our gradient tool, make sure that our foreground color is set to black. And then up here, I'm gonna go up to our click to open gradient picker and make sure it goes from black to transparent. So it will go from our foreground to transparent when I drag. So select that and then make sure our layer is going to be on soft light. I'm going to zoom out. So this is a really fun way to create gradients because you're not stuck with a circle. You can have any shape you want, and I will just click and drag, and our gradient will fall off from black to nothing. So it will be a nice smooth gradient, and I will drag in from the corner so it falls off. We'll have a nice dark corner up here and slowly come back into the image where we want you to look. I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom of the image, drag and drop our gradient, and create my own vignette. This is all to taste. I'm just doing this until my eye is not concentrated on these rocks and goes up towards this waterfall right here, because the most important part of this image is this waterfall. So that looks pretty good to me. If we turn that on and off, you can see it just kind of sucks your eye in towards the center of the image, and that is the whole goal of a vignette. So those were curves. What else do we have down here? We have a dodge and burn layer. So I'm going to turn that on, and that just, wow, that made a huge difference. So what does dodging and burning do? Dodging and burning is manipulating your highlights and your shadows. The ultimate goal is to make the viewer look where you want them to look and represent the image how you want it to be represented. So dodging and burning is a lot of fun to do. It's painting on top of your image and creating a whole new look. So as you can see, there's a huge difference in between the dodge and burn and when I take it off. It's just kind of flat. So let's actually delete this layer, and I'm going to go through and show you how to do some non-destructive dodging and burning. And you can always erase this or just shut the layer off because it's not on your main layer. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to set this layer to soft light, and then make sure that our foreground and our background layer is going to be on black and white. It doesn't really matter which one it is. You can flip back and forth, but your white is going to brighten up your image and your black is going to darken your image. So I'm going to press B and go to our brush, or you can go to your brush right here. Make sure that the hardness is all the way at 0. A fairly large size for affecting a large part of the image a large part of the image at once, and then turn down the opacity to about, it really depends on how much of an effect you want. So I'm going to leave it right here at about 50%, and then I'm going to go in, and since we're on white, we're going to be affecting the highlights and we're going to be brightening the image. So I'm going to go in, and as you can see, I'm painting in light into our image, and I'm painting in highlights. This is just, it's so powerful, and if that's too much, you can always go down and turn down the opacity. But I want to save some of these greens in here, and I can just do a couple strokes, and I'm painting in light. It's so awesome. Paint in a little bit of light here on some of these rocks just to grab the attention right here. That looks pretty good. And you can totally sculpt what you want your light to look like, how the light was hitting the trees in particular in this image up here towards the left, and then everything just kind of falls off into darkness. But I want to add, look at that, I can just completely edit the path of this waterfall, and your eye just follows the path of this waterfall here. I'll do the same here, brighten it up, and then as I said, we can flip between our foreground and background. Now our foreground color is black, and we can mess with our shadows. So if I did too much editing to the highlights, I can always bring it back just a little bit and tweak minor details. Some of those highlights were a little too bright, and then I can darken up my shadows in here as well, and just kind of have this area towards the sides of the image just fade off into dark nothing. And now I can turn this layer on and off, and you can see we've completely changed the way this image looks. We've added some depth to this image, and that's what you want. You want to lead the viewer's eye and create depth with your image. You don't want it to look super flat. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's look at our references. I think we got this dark and moody feel down pretty well. And again, what your final image is going to look like really depends on how you take your initial or raw image. If you take it again in bright sunlight, you may or may not be able to get as close to that feel as you want to. You can do a lot of editing in Photoshop, but it really depends on your photography skills as well. So that is all for this tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you like this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe and turn on your notifications for future videos just like this. And until next time, get out and go shoot.